Hey, welcome back. I'm James Johnson, as you well know. My expertise lies in retirement and estate planning, and I've got a guest with me today. His name is Scott McVicker. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks.
And you've heard me say year after year after year that you need to get to tax free. Now, this couldn't be more important if you were in a higher tax bracket or you're a higher net worth individual. Not only do you have to worry about taxes, but now you have to start worrying about things called estate taxes. And this can be really important. And so I brought Scott in Scott's part of our team, and Scott's a CPA. He's been around the business since the inception of the business. He's so old. I can tell you one thing about him: he can't surf. But the reality is that he does know a lot about premium financing, and more importantly, he knows a lot about how to get to tax free. So, Scott, let me just ask you some quick questions here.
Sure.
Would you agree with me that in the future taxes might just be a little higher than they are currently today?
I would agree with that.
Would you agree with me that estate taxes are a moving target?
Correct.
What do you think is going to happen with estate taxes going forward?
Well, I mean, of course, if we had a crystal ball, I could answer that, but I'll tell you that if you just look at a couple of things. One, we know that the law sunsets, that the current provision for these large exemptions that's been around since the Bush era are set to come back down. And that number hasn't been pegged, but everybody's talking about, getting back to kind of where they started, $3.5 million. Obviously, that's a function of politics, a lot of other things. I would leave it at. I remember when our national debt hit $8 trillion. And that was under the Obama administration. And everybody was like, we are never going to be able to dig out of this hole. It's $8 trillion. It's too big. And now it's $33 trillion. So think about that for a minute. If you look at just what it costs to fund to the debt service of the national debt, it's an enormous number. And the only way that that's ever been dealt with historically is to raise taxes, literally. So
yeah, and that's not even talking about the extra $1.8 trillion that they spend every year. And let's talk about the $120 trillion in unfunded deficit, okay, for Social Security, Medicare, and prescription drugs. Look, if you have even a little bit of sense of what's going on out there, taxes are going to go up. Now, this video is really directed towards people that have higher net worth or higher earners. Okay, you're up in the top marginal tax brackets. Maybe you're making $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 a year. Even though you're young, maybe you haven't hit the $5 million net worth yet. But here's the interesting thing about hitting $5 million net worth. The average person that hits $5 million net worth, depending upon what age they're at, is definitely going to have an estate tax problem in the future. And they never believe me when I tell them this, but then when I show them, they go like, there's no possible way I'm going to be worth $35 million. Do you think they'll actually make it to that?
I think it was Einstein said the greatest invention of mankind is compound interest. And you take $5 million and compound it over the life expectancy of a 35-year-old, they're going to have an estate tax problem, no question.
Now I know that you have multiple ways to save these listeners right here on taxes, but let's talk about your expertise, because I know that you are one of the original founders of something called premium finance. And people talk about premium finance all the time, but the funny thing is very few people do it, and more importantly, very few people know how to do it right. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about premium finance and your background in that.
Sure. I'd love to take credit for the founding part, but I was involved in the company that originated the concept. So been in this space for a long time, about 2002, so 20 plus years. It's interesting because over that period of time, which is related to what we just talked about, you go back to the early 2000s, the estate tax exemptions were much lower. So we looked at premium finance as really a way to fund estate taxes. So people have been buying life insurance for years, the high net worth client, to pay quote unquote estate taxes when they die. It provides liquidity. It does all the things we need to, but they've kind of hated doing it, right? Because they're paying large premiums. And their mindset is this is a necessary evil to pay a tax that just, really I'm not really happy about, because I paid income taxes on everything to generate this large estate that now the IRS is just waiting to take half of it. So that necessary evil component for life insurance was always there, but the premiums were high. So to write a six-figure premium check every year for a large death benefit to pay the estate taxes, it was a viable approach, but it was, at the end of the day, kind of painful for the high net worth
Well,
client.
it boils down to paying big dollars with small dollars is
Exactly.
what it boils down to.
Exactly.
But nobody wants to pay any dollars.
Yeah, exactly. And now that's an interesting comment that you say that, because we're going to get in a minute to kind of reshifting that perspective about life insurance, because it's not necessarily that way, but that's how the clients. So you start from the beginning. If I can reduce the way or the amount of capital that I have to spend, quote unquote, to fund a life insurance strategy, does the high net worth client typically have a positive reaction to that? Absolutely. I'd much rather pay $5,000 as an interest charge than $100,000 for the premium. So that evolution was taking large death benefits to pay estate taxes and funding it in a more efficient way by using a lender's capital to fund the premium, and then the client pays interest. And that was kind of the origination of the concept. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So now it's evolved to a completely different approach, which we can dovetail on, if that makes sense. But that was the beginning of the history of the concept, and it's kind of morphed from there with the evolution of products, insurance products today compared to what they were 20 years ago, which is, ain't my father's life insurance kind of story now, and as well as the shift in the estate tax environment, where the exemptions have gone up substantially. So there's a lot more you can shelter just from the exemptions themselves. So the perceived need for life insurance for estate taxes has gone down. And that's been an interesting evolution.
And that's especially true for those of you that are in the $5 to $13 million per person estate, because, well, my exemption covers that.
Right.
But as I said, estate taxes is a moving target, okay? And one thing that we can be sure about in life is that there will always be change, all right? And so I try to teach people to become proactive. I think that one of the biggest mistakes that people make when it comes to retirement is they're very reactive. They react to this law and to that law. If you're proactive, you're able to set some of this stuff in play far in advance and save tons of money. And not to mention, if it turns out you don't need it, then you're developing a larger net worth going forward to maybe pass on to your heirs or to your favorite charity or whatever it is your goal is.
Exactly. Then a larger, more efficient, tax efficient net worth. So you're basically repositioning capital in a much more efficient way for generational purposes. And that's really the aha. You just hit it without even me asking the question, where if we're looking at life insurance as a necessary evil, as an expense that I have to pay as the high net worth client to pay the evil IRS who's waiting to take half of my money, I mean, that's a perception that is kind of negative, biased, right? But they do, still make sense economically. They'll, move forward and do the insurance. I try to shift the client's thinking centered around what you just said. And if we had a magic wand, right, or a crystal ball, probably a better way to say it, every client would know exactly how much of their current capital base they're going to consume during their lifetimes. And what would you venture to say for the average high net worth client? If their asset base is, whatever it is, as a percentage of that asset base today, how much will they actually consume during their lifetimes?
It's a very small number, depending upon your net worth.
Right.
What's really funny about a higher net worth people, not all of them, you can't put anybody in one group.
True.
But if you look at them, often they're still living below their means by a lot, not a little bit.
Amount.
This is why once you hit that $5 million, $10 million, you only got one way to go, and that's up.
Yeah.
Let's just say you had $10 million, okay, and you were only making 6% on it.
Yep.
That's $600,000 a year. That doesn't include your other known incomes, such as
Correct.
Social Security, pensions, rental properties,
Yep.
etc. And so you can't spend it fast enough.
Right.
You could give it away, you could spend it, but the reality is you probably won't.
Exactly.
All right. So your net worth is only going to go up from that point forward. And if you're looking down the road, the chances of you having an estate tax problem are about 100%.
Absolutely. And if you think from that perspective, if a client, it's kind of the story of, remember the millionaire next door? And with the asset growth over the last 20, 30 years, we're really talking about the $10 million heir next door, where a lot of clients have just kind of their net worth with real estate businesses, the stock market, of course, has exploded. And to your point, they're already, their need of capital is a sliver of that entire asset base. So what does that mean when you kind of think forward? The rest of that capital is already somebody else's in the future. And who is the somebody else? It's their kids, their grandkids, their family, right? So what I encourage clients to do is look at that from a more of a CEO perspective, because when it's their capital, we tend to be, it's fear and greed, right? That's the primary motives of human beings. And it's like, I got to make sure I have enough. This is my capital. This is my capital. Once a client is able to kind of understand and internalize that most of that capital they're never going to need or touch. Like you said, they're not even they're living off the income and growth, and still have it's still compounding. So if you think about it like a CEO, if a CEO enabled capital for on the corporate balance sheet that's needed in 20 years for a new building, let's say, and it's like they leave it in a taxable money market account for the next 20 years because they just never got around to doing something different with it, or didn't want to pull the trigger or whatever. CEOs get kind of fired for those kinds of decisions. So encourage people to look at it as, look, you're really the CEO, the trustee, the fiduciary, for lack of a better term, of a capital base that's going to survive you. And if we can get them to shift that thinking, life insurance all of a sudden becomes, and you know this very well, when you strip it away, the rate of return on life insurance based strategies adjusted for risk and taxes is commensurate with a lot of other asset classes that bring a whole lot of risk to it and taxation. So if we can create a secondary bucket, and then ideally now pivot to the premium finance, have a lender fund it, because now we've got opportunity cost, right? This all makes sense over the long run. I've got all this capital I'm never going to spend, but it's invested in that real estate and this stock portfolio and this and that and this business over here. But the economics are compelling. That's where premium finance comes into place. We can fund this really efficient bucket of capital. And if it gets used to pay estate taxes, great. But if it doesn't, it'll stand on its own as an asset all day long.
Well, remember that most people believe that are in this arena, they don't believe they need life insurance.
Great point.
Okay, by the way, I don't even call it life insurance, because the reality for most people, that's simply death insurance. Okay, you're buying it for the heirs down the road. Now, there is a way, as we well know, to design it for life insurance so we can use it while we're alive. But once you begin to understand these things that you're talking about, this is no longer about a want. Yeah. This is about a need, rather.
Yeah.
This is about a want. Yeah. I want that, right. Okay? And why would I want that? What about that would make me want that?
Well, it's a great question, and if you kind of take that a step back, it's what you really need is what? Air, water, food. I mean, everything else is a subjective concept. And when you look at life insurance from that perspective of generational wealth, then in that scenario, the asset called life insurance will typically outperform a significant portion of assets that are left subject to income and estate taxes. I mean, if you really run the math, and I'm a CPA by background, and I've done this, and I got a spreadsheet that shows it, in interest income that's taxable in an estate that's going to be above the estate tax thresholds, and it's just reinvested, like a bond portfolio, for example, the real rate of return on that is negative, about a negative 3%. Annualized return at life expectancy on a bond portfolio when you pay income taxes, reinvest it into the taxable estate, and then pay estate taxes. So the takeaway there is that a decision to do nothing is still a decision, I often say. So the status quo of doing nothing is large estates have capital like that. I can always find it on the balance sheet. Can we segregate a portion of it and reposition it as generational wealth, free of income taxes, free of estate taxes, subject to creditors, lawsuits? I call it no matter what capital. Nothing can take it away. And it's funded for a purpose of generational aspects, and we use the lender's capital to do it. When a client looks at that on a one-pager saying, geez, I'm already doing this by virtue of a decision to do nothing is still a decision, look at the math. If we just reposition a little bit of capital with a lender's capital to help out, it's a phenomenally effective strategy.
And then on top of that, when I'm sitting down from all ranges of clients, from the lower end up, it's always about finding the money. It really is about finding the money. And the question that I ask them is, if I can find money that you're currently transferring unknowingly and unnecessarily out of your life, would you save it? So what that means is you're already spending it. So what if you could put it over here? And I know you know ways that if you're a higher net worth individual, that you could save dramatically on taxes today, and then use that money to fund this process going forward. Is that something you'd like to talk a little bit now here, or is that something we should talk about at a further date?
I mean, yeah, that's probably 2.0, but the concept is worth touching on, which is, it's again back to that opportunity cost. It's if the traditional way, unfortunately, for positioning premium finance is to make the insurance cheaper, make the premium lower by having an interest payment instead. It's a flawed way to look at it. The optimal way is to say, it's like, would you go by, remember we were driving by that building by your place today? I'm like, what the heck's up with that? The one that was like all abandoned or whatever. Mm-hmm. If you picture that building in your mind's eye, and all of a sudden a for sale sign went up in it. Would you buy it because a bank was going to lend you money to buy it? That the way that the shape that building was in the condition.
Boy, it'd be a hell of a deal.
Exactly right. So the perspective is like, no, I'm not going to go buy an asset just because I can finance it. I need to look at the asset first and say, do the economics make sense for me? And when we position life insurance that way, using the premium financing concept, the math speaks for itself. So in that scenario, it enables a whole shift in that thinking, and then the premium financing becomes more of a timing issue because most of the clients that we work with have good real estate and good assets. They don't want to liquidate right now. And if they're in the old-fashioned way, if they die, there's forced liquidation unless there's life insurance to pay the. I don't like to talk about the lowest probability outcome. I like to talk about the highest probability outcome, which is that most clients, statistically, actuarially, will live to life expectancy, and a lot of them will live past that. Very few will have a premature death. Make sense? Mm-hmm. So if we can take a scenario where a lender's capital comes in, funds a compelling asset with all kinds of tax efficiency, commensurate returns, sheltered from everything that can take it away, realizing that that lender has to be taken out at some point, right? And it can be amortized, it can be interest only, but ultimately capital that exists now in the future is going to have to be liquidated, and it should be, because there's going to be a change in the client's perspectives about their assets, this and that. So if that's done, this is the whole point to your question, during a 10-year period, let's say, just throwing that out, using estate planning strategies. So here's an asset we don't want to sell right now. It's a compelling asset. We love this concept. We framed it right. The client sees the benefit, but it's kind of a tug of war. We don't want to sell this asset right now. Lender funds the asset. Over 10 years, we move this asset little by little using estate planning strategies outside of the taxable estate into a trust, for example. So now we've got an asset that it might be a business, or maybe it's a future liquidity event kind of a thing. Now we sell that asset outside of the estate. We moved it outside of the estate. That's liquid. We pay off the lender, and we have an unencumbered, tax-free and estate tax-free growing asset for generations, like literally generation after generation after generation.
So throughout history, and I don't know, you've done how many hundreds of these things over your lifetime?
I've lost count.
Okay, it's a bunch.
Yeah.
And so one thing what we know is that interest rates are variable, and interest rates are also relative.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So interest rates are very high right now. Yeah. So how does that work in this environment? Does this actually work?
Oh, absolutely, and it's another great question. And it's all about perspective. Everything's about perspective, which is kind of like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? You said they're really high right now. I remember literally going out to dinner with my wife and celebrating our first mortgage, which we locked in at 10.5%, and we were thrilled with that. 1991. So everything's a relative, right? It does lead to an interesting point, which is what I view as a very misguided focus on the interest rate situation relative to premium finance instead of the real value to it. Best way to explain it is just real estate, because most clients get it, right? If we had a building and you had a realtor that had a crystal ball and comes into your office one day and says, that building across the street you've been looking at for the last few years, it's going up for sale. I'm getting the listing. I came to you first. And I have a crystal ball that says it's going to appreciate 7% per year every year for the next 20 years. So it's $1 million building. It's going to be worth $4 million in 20 years. That's a guarantee. Take it to the bank. Would you look at buying that building?
Certainly would consider it.
Surely we consider it. Now, what would you do, by the way, before you actually pulled the trigger? Probably go get inspected. Do a little due diligence, make sure this asset's really, so it's kind of a key point because, with this life insurance asset that the clients are not looking at it as an asset, they don't really want to do the due diligence. We have to encourage them and help them to kind of see it that way. But once you've done that and you decide, this building's a solid buy, it's $1 million, $4 million in the future, you're about to write a check for $1 million, right? And before you do that, your lender buddy comes in and says, whoa, wait a minute. I hear you're going to buy a building. It's guaranteed to appreciate for 7% per year, up to $4 million. I can lend you money right now at 3%, a couple of years ago, right? So in that scenario, you've got an opportunity for a spread between 3% and 7%, right? What do we call that, by the way?
Arbitrage.
Arbitrage, correct. Now, is that a viable, attractive characteristic for the financing of an asset? Of course it is.
You have any sense of finance?
Right. Here's the problem. Well, if it's only based on arbitrage, what happens if the loan rate goes up to 7%? Mm-hmm. And now all our arbitrage went away, right?
Or we don't appreciate that yet.
Exactly right. Or if it's a building and it's 2008 and next year it's worth half of what you paid for it, right? And that's happened. And historically, it doesn't come roaring back all the time like we've been enjoyed. That's a side point where we lose assets, devaluate, and then come right back again. Historically, that typically doesn't happen. So now to finish that story, so now you're saying, well, geez, of course I'll take advantage of that opportunity, right? The lender's going to lend me at 3, and I got an asset that's appreciating at 7, guaranteed with the crystal ball. Realtor comes back in and says, well, wait a minute. I knew you had $1 million to spend on the building, and it came up for sale. I brought it to you, but I didn't know your lender buddy was going to come into the mix. I got 9 other buildings just like it, and you can put 100 grand down on each one of them and buy all 10 of them for the same $1 million. Now you got $10 million of asset instead of 1 million, appreciating at 7%. Okay, what do we call that concept?
Leverage.
Exactly. So this is a concept called a leveraging strategy, which by definition is funding an asset efficiently, more efficiently than just paying cash for the asset. Well, the industry is focused on the arbitrage element. And if that doesn't come into play and that's all that was focused on, it breaks down because there's going to be collateral implications. The interest rate might go up, all those things that we know about. So it's all back to framing. This is about leverage and about a more efficient way to fund this asset. And the only way to get there is to spend the commensurate time with the client, getting them to have a repositioning of their own perspective, because they come into it typically thinking life insurance is an expense. I'd really rather not have to pay it. Everybody's telling me I need it, all the things we've talked about. Let's just shift it around. You're already doing it. The capital already exists. Decision to do nothing is still a decision. This asset stands on its own, and we can have a lender fund it for now and then take it out later on with some of these estate planning strategies.
So a couple more questions, and then I'm going to have you just like tell the story a little bit more. But one, well, how come everybody doesn't do this?
Everybody has probably been pitched it. I said, well, maybe not everybody, but the vast majority of high net worth clients have probably, it's been kind of the whole shift in how to fund life insurance over the last, especially in the last 6-7 years with the evolution of the products, which we have not touched on. Ultimately, I would answer that question in this way, because most advisors reinforce the client's misperceptions, not intentionally, but they literally come in and say, oh, I know you didn't want to write a $100,000 check for the life insurance. I wouldn't want to write that check either. What if I could show you a way to get the same life insurance for $5,000? Would that be of interest? In the initial pass, most clients are going to say, heck yeah. Well, now we got to talk about personal guarantees and collateral and interest rates that aren't locked in and all those things. And if we haven't shifted the client's thinking about this being an asset, not an expense, then most clients are going to just get down halfway down the field and go, overload.
Well, I suppose that answers this question, but why don't I just go to my current advisor and get my current advisor to do this for me?
Well, the vast majority aren't doing it, for one. I mean, there's only a handful of providers in the space that know how to do it. Frankly, I mean, I don't want to be negative, but
I completely understand that they don't.
Yeah.
They don't understand this. That there is a handful of us in this country that really know this, and this isn't just us sitting here working. We have a team of people behind us.
Right.
We have a design team. There's
a lot of pieces to that stool.
There's a lot. There's bank relationships.
Yes.
There's a whole lot that goes into this. This is not something you just go, okay, it's done. You've really got to go out and do your homework.
Exactly.
All right.
Yep.
So if you were going to close this out and you were going to tell this audience right here, what would your input to them be with regards to why you should take the time to set up a no cost, no obligation meeting with us where we can sit down and show you how this actually works for you?
I didn't see that one coming. That's a great. I'd have to say, I have to bring it personal at this point. My take is we are in a pretty volatile, uncertain world right now. There's a lot going on. Globally, macroeconomically, in our country, the national debt that we talked about. And, I look in the future and I say, without a crystal ball, is there a possibility that we go from this long-term post-World War II, for the most part, hunky-dory-ish environment for years now, decades, to potentially a sustained period of challenge, economic challenge? Yeah, it's possible. Is it going to happen? I don't know, but it's certainly possible. You look at the Japan stock market in 1989, hit its all-time high, 39,000, the Nikkei, and 7 years later it was at 7,000. 39,000. Can you imagine that? And the Dow just coincidentally is about at 39,000, right? Can you imagine it going down to 7,000 in the next 7-8 years?
There'd be a lot of sad people.
It would be catastrophic to a lot of people because they're fully invested and they're taught to ride out the ups and downs over the long run. Well, once you start consuming capital or it starts getting taxed for generational transfer, we know that when capital is needing to be spent on something when it's already down because of a market correction, that's a catastrophic event. It's called sequence of returns, and I think you've talked about it a lot. I would say, if you're that CEO mindset, if you look at your asset base and say, I'm already managing this capital for the people that I love, and I'm saying I'm not going to spend this all, does it make sense to reposition a portion of it, some sensible portion, from risk-oriented assets to no matter what capital, is what I call it. And when I put that head into the mix, and I'm thinking about myself and what my grandparents went through with the situation and this and that, I'm like, yes, it makes sense. So we're back to that paradox. Great, it makes sense, but do I want to sell this now? Do I want to pay capital gains tax to do this? Let's let the lender do it and take 10 years or 15 years to input a methodical, well thought out estate planning strategy or strategies to move capital from here to here, and then free that capital up in a tax-free environment to take out the lender. And now we have an enormous, by the way, this is how the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, even with the old products that aren't nearly as awesome as the ones today, that's what they did to create generational wealth, which enabled them to continue to do the other things, the banking and the steel and whatever, because they created enormous amounts of capital using all the people in those families for life insurance-based strategies, interestingly enough. So we have a precedent, it's worked, it's stable, and it's sensible, and now we have the next generation of products that you're well versed in. There, you're like,
phenomenal.
Wow, yes. So weave it all together. And now back to how I started, in a time of great uncertainty. So we can take great uncertainty and stabilize it with this concept called financed life insurance.
And do it in a 100% tax-free environment.
Absolutely.
It's if you go back to the original thing I said, taxes are going to go up.
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
Now the question is, do you want to pay them?
Yep.
And if you don't want to pay them, what's your plan? Yep. How are you going to go about solving that problem? And how do you become a little bit more proactive? The worst thing you can do is to stand still. I don't understand that. Oh, that's too complicated. And all the other things that I hear along the way. That's our job. Our job is to
Absolutely.
uncomplicate it. And one thing I know about you is you do a very good job of uncomplicating it. All right. It's unfortunate that there are not more people like you out in the world. And I also know this: the team behind us is phenomenal. All right. I mean, Chris and his team are phenomenal.
Absolutely.
You won't find somebody that could design this better than anybody than they can.
I would agree.
Right? And so, in closing, what I encourage you to do is, one, if you're watching this on YouTube or on LinkedIn, put some comments below. But two, take the time to reach out to us. And if you reach out to us, we'll also, at that point, we'll provide you with some educational courses to continue your education on this and to start learning about how to get proactive. Now, if your net worth isn't nearing $5 million, then this is probably not going to work for you. Would that be a safe bet?
Absolutely. Yep.
If you're not making at least $600,000 a year, and maybe your net worth is a little bit below $5 million, it's probably not going to work for you. If you are making that kind of money and you're on a trajectory course that way, it can work for you. And the last question I would ask you is that, let's say I'm convinced that I'm at $5 million here, or $6 or $10 million in net worth, and between me and my wife, and I don't think I'm ever going to hit estate taxes. Okay,
Yeah.
Would this stuff still work for me?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's back to the evolution of the products, which we really didn't have a lot of time, but you cover it in your course better than anyone I've ever seen. So, but when you take today's products that enable us to overfund them, max fund them, as we talk about, we're literally creating a tax-free asset base that, I mean, what we didn't talk about was all the expenses and things that can take capital away besides market risk. And you think of a managed portfolio, traditional investment, you've got income taxes along the way, you've got all the management expenses. Would you agree that those two combined over the long run is probably going to be north of 200 basis points annual expenses on a bucket like that, maybe more?
And probably a lot more that you don't see.
Right,
exactly.
exactly.
What you do see is one thing, what you don't see is
Right.
a whole nother.
Well, now think about that, and then we're back to that misperception. So if somebody thinks of life insurance on a 70-year-old male, do they think expensive or cheap?
Expensive.
It's
not even possible.
Prohibitively
impossible.
expensive.
Okay.
So if I could tell you, and you already know this, but for the audience's sake, if we can create a bucket of capital that the lender makes more efficient, we're back to that efficiency, and that's leverage. Would it be surprising for the audience to know that the complete all-in expenses being taken out of that life insurance bucket on a 70-year-old male, if it was funded this way, is about 25 basis points, 1/4 of 1%. We were at 300 or 200%, 200 basis points, whatever you want to say. We're literally a tenth of that. And you think about the time value of money aspect of that. Well, what does that mean? Well, some people might say, oh, well, it's a better investment. No. I mean, it could be looked at that way. I think of it this way. I can achieve commensurate results with much less risk. I can achieve commensurate results with this ultra tax-free, tax-efficient, 25 basis point expenses annualized, all in, this concept of overfunded life insurance, and achieve the same amount of same measure of results that I would have to take massive risk with real estate or stocks or whatever. Doesn't make those investments better, worse. They're just different. So we're carving out, again, creating a bucket of capital that's unique, and no other asset base can provide what it does.
Well, that goes back to one of my favorite sayings. If everything you thought to be true turned out to not be true, when would you want to know? Would you want to wait and find out later? Or would you want to know like right now?
That's a great way to say it.
And so remember, subscribe to the channel. I want to thank Scott for coming here. I'm looking forward to meeting each and every one of you. And Scott's looking forward to working with you and helping you to really turn your world around and increase your net worth going forward. Because after all, you have one goal in life. You want to live the lifestyle you become accustomed to, adjusted for taxes and inflation, out beyond yours and your spouse's life expectancy. And that's a pretty easy thing to do. We can design plans to do that where you're not running out of your money. But the more important part comes in the end and your exit strategy, and that is you want to pass your money on in the most tax-favored way possible to your children. You do not have a relationship with someone in the government where you're dying to give them your money rather than yourself or your family. You want to pass it on to your family. So what's your plan? Do you have one? Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And remember to live like you're going to die tomorrow and plan like you're going to live forever, because you just might. We look forward to meeting you soon. Keep smiling and make it a great day.